Laudetur Jesus Christus, praise be Jesus Christ. This is Matt Gaspers, Managing Editor of Catholic Family News, and I'm joined as always by my friend and colleague, Dr. Brian McCall, who is the Editor-in-Chief of CFN. Hello, Brian. I hope you're continuing to enjoy the Paschal season. Christ is risen.
Yeah, indeed he has. Yes, we are having a great extended celebration of Easter. We were fortunate for Good Shepherd Sunday to have the entire St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary, including the seminary rector, visit the local parish where we are here. So for every Good Shepherd Sunday is a day dedicated to vocations.
Yes.
And so the whole, roughly 100 seminarians, several of the priests and the rector were here. And we had actually at the church 3 solemn high masses because there were so many priests there, and then seminarians who could sing and serve, that all 3 masses on the Sunday was pretty extraordinary to have as solemn high with sacred ministers.
Oh, that's wonderful. That gives the opportunity for some of the young men who have received the minor orders to exercise them in a parish setting. Normally they're at the seminary, but I'm sure that's a special experience for them.
We were thinking of having a couple women get designated, in the new ceremony and do that, but we really decided against that now.
Yes, very fun, very good. So we got some interesting stories for you this week. It's kind of, compared to a lot of weeks, it's seemingly been a little bit of a slower week, but then you start digging into things and you realize you uncover some things you didn't expect. So I think you'll find it interesting. Yeah. Our topics this week include, first of all, the observance of Earth Day by Pope Francis and President Joe Biden, including a brief look at the concerning, really disturbing origins of the environmentalist movement. Secondly, we're going to look at President Biden's climate change summit, which started yesterday and is continuing into today. So it's really dovetails with the first story. And this summit features remarks by numerous world leaders, including, of course, Pope Francis, but also Chinese president and leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. And I think you'll find the similarities between their word choice very, very interesting. Also, we're going to report on some news involving 2 notoriously pro-LGBT bishops, one German and one American. And finally, a major new contribution to the debate over COVID vaccines, which has been written by our very own Christopher Ferrara and is available on our website. We hope that everyone gets around to reading it. It is a bit of a lengthy read, but it's chock full of information. You don't go more than a couple sentences without either a footnote or a hyperlink. So it's very well written, it's very well documented, and it needs to be known. So before we get into all of the news, as we always do, we'll take a brief look at the liturgical calendar and spend a few moments pondering the things that are above, as St. Paul says, the spiritual riches of our faith, which we desperately need when we're talking about all of this unsettling news, as we often do. So today is Friday, April 23rd, 2021. And on the traditional Roman calendar, it is the feast of St. George, the famous soldier and martyr who died, I believe, during the reign of Diocletian, somewhere in that era. And he's a saint that we don't know a whole lot about him with certainty, but there is a lot of customary beliefs, you might say, about him that have arisen over the centuries, particularly during the Middle Ages, associated with chivalry and knighthood, and of course the story about the slaying of the dragon. I was looking up on the Catholic Encyclopedia just to familiarize myself a little more with his life, and here's what that article says. It says, martyr, patron of England, suffered at or near Lydda, also known as Diospolis, in Palestine, probably before the time of Constantine, and Constantine came to power in the early 300s I forget the exact year. I know the Edict of Milan was 313, or was it 312? One of those two. The Catholic Encyclopedia goes on to say, according to the very careful investigation of the whole question recently instituted by Father DeLahaye, and this was in the early 1900s, the above statement sums up that all that can safely be affirmed about St. George, in other words, with relative certainty based on the historical record. I don't know if Brian had anything he wanted to add about how St. George became associated with England, because he has a very strong connection to the English nation.
He does, and there's sure that main fact, he's the patron of England, and so we wish all of our English viewers a happy St. George's Day, because he is the patron of
Yes.
the nation of England. But he also has associated with him this story of the slaying of the dragon. You know, he's associated with slaying the dragon, and again, there's from a literary perspective, these stories really circulate from the earliest times in the Middle Ages, but it's not really clear what the historical origin of that story is, what he did. We know he did something, and we don't know whether it was literal, there was some physical danger that or whether it is on some kind of a spiritual level, because the dragon in the sort of layers of allegory that are in symbolism in the apocalypse, for example, at one level represents the Roman emperor and the Roman Empire. So we don't know really what the origin is, but we know it is a universal story that sort of spans European countries, that St. George somehow was victorious over the dragon, although he loses his life as a result in the process. So one of those mysteries in the beatific vision, maybe we'll be able to spend eternity learning about. But yes, in particularly after the time of the Crusades, when I think the English come in contact with the story, he is eventually adopted as the patron saint of England, to guard over England. His cross, St. George's cross, becomes the symbol of the English flag, as opposed to the United Kingdom's. The flag you may think of as the United Kingdom is really not the flag of England. England's flag is white with a red cross, which is St. George's cross. We're very reminiscent of the cross of the Crusades. And so he has always been seen as the protector of England. So, and perhaps maybe if any of our English viewers know a little bit more about the connection and how specifically, they can put it in the comments to the video and share it with our viewers.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. That'd be great. So of course we ask St. George's intercession, especially for members of the military, as he is also a patron of them.
Yes.
And a lot of our soldiers, unfortunately, are being persecuted in the United States and elsewhere for their faith. So he is a powerful intercessor on their behalf.
Yes.
All right, so we'll get started with the news for today. Our first story involves this thing called Earth Day, which, to be honest, I mean, I remember hearing about it as a kid. I wasn't really familiar with its origin, so I decided to do a little research. And here's what I discovered. That apparently the day has an official website, earthday.org, and they have a history page. So, I mean, I'm taking it as they're being honest with the history. So essentially it boils down to this Wisconsin senator named, Gaylord Nelson, a junior senator from Wisconsin, had long been concerned about the deteriorating environment in the United States. Then in January 1969, he and many others witnessed the ravages of a massive oil spill in Santa Barbara, California. Inspired by the student anti-war movement, Senator Nelson wanted to infuse the energy of student anti-war protests with an emerging public consciousness about air and water pollution. Senator Nelson, the website goes on, says, announced the idea for a teach-in on college campuses to the national media, which I'm not real familiar with what that would look like. Do you know, what is a teach-in? Is it similar to like a protest of some kind, Brian?
I mean, sort of, but it's like where some professors come, some liberal professor comes and sort of leads the protest by teaching some class or lecture.
Right. So, I mean, even from its inception and the way that it was rolled out, so to speak, by the way, the first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970. which also happened to be the birth anniversary of Vladimir Lenin. So I'm sure that was
Ah,
I'm sure that was just a coincidence. But
yes.
it seems to have some, liberal, leftist, even probably even Marxist undertones, even from its inception. Would you
Mm.
say that's accurate?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So scrolling down here a little bit, it says, moving down to Earth Day today, it says, today, Earth Day is widely recognized as the largest secular observance in the world, marked by more than 1 billion with a B people every year as a day of action to change human behavior and create global, national, and local policy changes. So we're going to get into what kinds of changes in behavior. It goes far beyond, getting people to recycle and be good stewards of God's earth. That's kind of the veneer, but what's underneath is much more sinister. So in honor of this Earth Day, Pope Francis, of course, very predictably released a video message. He probably does every year for this in light of Laudato Si and other things. So here's a few quotes from his video address. He says, quote, "For some time now, we have been becoming more aware that nature deserves to be protected." That we've always been aware of that to some degree, that God's command to tend and keep the earth to Adam, that goes back to the very beginnings. It's not like we're just now becoming aware of this. Pope Francis goes on, if only because human interaction with God's biodiversity must take place with the utmost care and respect. Caring for biodiversity, caring for nature. And we have learned this more clearly in this pandemic. No surprise tying it back to the pandemic.
He's the Pope who claimed the pandemic was nature punishing us for our environmental sins.
Right, nature
Yes.
throwing a fit, I think.
Yes,
was
the phrase he used, yes.
Yes. The pandemic has also shown us what happens when the world stops, pauses, even for a few months, and the powerful impact that this has on nature and climate change in a sadly positive way, has it not? So I guess he's claiming that the lockdowns and the shutdown of society has been good for the earth, but I don't know if he realizes how devastating it's been for humanity.
For actual people, right?
Right, exactly. He also says, quote, in short, the COVID pandemic taught us about this interdependence, this sharing of the planet, and both global catastrophes, namely COVID and climate change, show us that there's no time to lose. Time is pressing, and as COVID-19 taught us, yes, we have the means to rise up to the challenge. We have the means. It is time to act. We are at the limit. And finally, he says, I would like to repeat an old Spanish saying, God always forgives. Well, that should be qualified when you're actually repentant.
When you seek it, right?
Right. We humans forgive from time to time. Nature no longer forgives. And when this destruction of nature is triggered, it is very difficult to stop. So again, he's like personifying the planet, basically, as he's done in the past, Mother Earth and all of this stuff. Obviously, Pachamama comes to mind, that she is going to punish us if we don't, she's going to chastise us if we don't change our evil ways and start living in accord with her.
Again, he's clearly moved from the poetic reference to Mother Nature, which is purely poetic and anthropomorphizing in just a poetic sense, to literally speaking about nature as if it is a rational being, right? Nature is not. Nature is merely the sum of all creation in the way he's using it, but he speaks about it as if it has a consciousness, an intellect, and a will, right? And from all these various statements, which is pantheism. It's just believing that God is immanent in all of nature. There is no God distinct from creation, right? Because God is distinct from creation because he is its cause, to right. Just making it convertible, right? That nature and God are one and the same thing, which is clearly heretical.
Yes. So then very briefly, President Biden also gave a lengthy, too lengthy in my opinion, proclamation for Earth Day, going on and on about how important it is. And apparently he had a special relationship with the senator who had the idea of instituting the day. But ultimately, he says in his proclamation, more than 50 years ago, a generation rallied to confront the environmental crises they faced. They took action in hopes that those in power would listen. Today, a new generation, namely my commentary, those pushing the so-called Green New Deal, and young people like Greta Thunberg, they are sounding the alarm louder than ever, demanding that world leaders act. It is in all our interest to rise to that challenge. Notice the same language that Pope Francis used, rise to that challenge and let our legacy be one of action. So now we're going to discuss what exactly are these changes that they ultimately want to implement. And this is where we're going to get into the origins of environmentalism in general. It dawned on, I remember hearing something about this a few years ago, but never really looked into it. The last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, after the fall, you might say the controlled demolition, some people would describe it, of the Soviet Union, because communism obviously did not die. He got very involved in the environmentalist movement. Very shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this big international conference held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 about environmentalism. And then in, I believe it was 1993, he founded something called the Green Cross International, something like that, some nonprofit to further the goals of environmentalism. And then in 1994, he authored, with a gentleman named Maurice Strong, this document called the Earth Charter. And just to give you an idea of what he thought of this document, Gorbachev said during a 1997 interview, quote, "My hope is that this charter will be a kind of 10 Commandments, a Sermon on the Mount that provides a guide for human behavior toward the environment in the next century and beyond." So that's pretty obviously sacrilegious language to be using, talking about a new 10 Commandments, a new Sermon on the Mount that's based on environmentalism. And I'll
gets
provide
worse.
A link. Oh, it does. It
Yes.
very much does. But I'll provide a link to the actual Earth Charter in the comments section so people can have a look at it. I mean, the document is, it's 4 pages long. It's clearly based on a worldview that believes in evolution, and that man, says nothing about God. So I'll just give you a couple of sample texts from it. It says, humanity is part of a vast evolving universe. Earth, our home, is alive with a unique community of life. So again, it's personifying Earth as if it's as Brian was explaining, a rational being, which it's not. The forces of nature make existence a demanding and uncertain adventure, but Earth has provided the conditions essential to life's evolution. So clearly this document is based on the false ideology of evolutionism. Earlier this year, we published an excellent series on kind of debunking some of the myths about that worldview. So it goes on to talk about, basically it lists 16 principles that are, some of which are based on the principle respect and care for the community of life, respect Earth and life in all its diversity, for example, build democratic societies that are just, participatory, sustainable, but that's become a very common term in the environmental lexicon, sustainable development. It also goes into, at some point it talks about population being too large.
Yeah.
Here we go. It says here, the global situation under that heading, it says an unprecedented rise in human population has overburdened ecological and social systems. The foundations of global security are threatened. The trends are perilous. So again, another core tenet of this Earth Charter is the belief that the population is too large. So obviously that means pushing abortion, contraception, et cetera, et cetera. So going on, getting back to this notion of it being like the new 10 commandments, in 2001, a very disturbing event took place in Vermont. A handwritten copy of the Earth Charter was placed inside something called the Ark of Hope. Brian has the website pulled up. That's a picture of it. It's basically it's a mock version of the Ark of the Covenant. See, again, notice the theme. It's a mocking of the true faith and salvation history. So from this website about this thing, it says the Ark of Hope was created for a celebration of the Earth Charter held at Shelburne Farms, Vermont on September 9th, 2001. The event, called For Love of Earth, featured keynote speaker Jane Goodall, who, by the way, will be speaking at this upcoming 5th International Vatican Conference on Global Health in early May. Also featured global peace walker Satish Kumar. I don't know what a peace walker is. Musician Paul Winter and Dr. Stephen C. Rockefeller, a member of the Earth Charter Commission of the famous Rockefeller family. So very disturbing, all of this environmentalism. Ultimately, I came across a good article when I was doing research for this story called Green is the New Red, the Metamorphosis of Communism. So it's really, it's a veiled form of the communist movement. That's very clear based on its ideological agenda. So we have a great article. We published a great article in November of 2019 by a contributor named Stephanie Nicholas called Climate Apocalypse Now, ? Climate Change Hysteria and the Eco Counter Church. So I'll include a link to that article for viewers who want to learn more about what Stephanie Nicholas referred to as the dubious science, and she has lots of references throughout her article going through also the propaganda.
And again, this is what we've seen in the pandemic, this trump card of science. So all of a sudden you just say, oh, this is science, go away. When it's really actually not science. When you look at it in terms of what is science, science is open. Science always has the possibility of being corrected. It always says these are theories that, you know, we always want to test and question, where what they propose as science is always the opposite. It's just inconsistent. Don't even look at evidence that doesn't that doesn't agree with the propaganda. And I'll give a real quick example that's in addition to Stephanie's wonderful article, because I have it recently. I saw an article this week where one of these sort of scare stories about how the Earth's going to, turn into this, apocalyptic, inhospitable place very soon. And it says in it, I was reading at one point, it says that the last time in the Earth's, history that CO2 levels were as high as they are now, like millions and millions of years ago, they claimed, here are all the horrible things that went on. There was no polar ice cap. It was scorching heats. It went on listing all these terrible things. So I read it and I paused and went, wait a minute. If the narrative is CO2 levels are really high because population's too high, that's how they do the population link. There's too many people here.
Right.
And there's too many emissions of burning of fossil fuels. Well, then how did CO2 levels get this high millions of years ago when there were, according to them, like no people and certainly no mechanical engines burning fossil fuels?
Right.
Right? Like, wouldn't that be the basic question? You go, wait a minute, if in the Earth's history you're saying levels were as high as they are now, then how could anything we're doing now have caused that in the past? Well, it couldn't. So how then is it causing it now? Like, shouldn't there be another cause? It just is another example where real scientists would say, wait a minute, if this data is true, that there's been CO2 levels this high in the past, well, then maybe there's something cyclical going on and not something we're doing now that couldn't have been done then. We need to look at this again. But no, the whole point is, again, not that temperature may not be changing, not that things may be happening on the Earth, but that it's political, not scientific.
Yes. And one other thing before we move on to the related story to this Earth Day, one of the seminal works for modern environmentalism is a book called Ecology: Can We Survive Under Capitalism? and it was written in 1972, so 2 years after, published in 1972, 2 years after the first Earth Day. And the author is a man named Gus Hall, who served as the chairman of the Communist Party USA from 1959 until his death in the year 2000.
Yes.
So that also is very telling about the origins and the purpose of this movement. Very dangerous.
Yes, because obviously their point is if we can blame all these scary things on capitalism, then communism becomes the answer. Oh, see what capitalism produced.
Yes.
And just like the neo-paganism. I mean, it's interesting that ark, sacrilegious ark thing. You know, what the fathers of the church told us is that paganism before the coming of Christ contained these shadowy images of the true religion, that at the time of Adam, everyone knew the true religion in the world. But by the time of the history progressed, and we have things like the Tower of Babel with language being broken down, that clear understanding of religion got totally destroyed, and people had just these vague ideas that traced back to the true religion, but had been distorted with the exception of the chosen people. And that's why God had to choose them to say, hey, you've, like, after these thousands of years, you've gotten off track. Here's the true religion. But then the fathers tell us paganism post-Christ is a mockery or because now the true religion's been revealed to all, not just the chosen people. So post-Christian paganism is of a different sort, right? Because it's one that is now in parody of the true religion and in mockery of it. And you can clearly see that with this dual forces of communism and neo-paganism coming together.
Right. Exactly right. That's, I think, a good segue into our next story, which is very much related to all of this stuff.
Yes. So speaking of which, guess who is this frontline cheerleader for this whole movement? The nominally was baptized Catholic Joe Biden. And he called for this week a Leaders Summit on Climate. So reading from the Department of State's website about this event, just give you a little bit of background. So the president invited 40 world leaders to participate in the virtual, of course, got to be good COVID people, Leaders Summit on Climate, which happened yesterday and today, the 23rd, as the U.S. government re-enters the global climate fight. President Biden is convening this summit early in his presidency to ensure close coordination with key players in the international community at the highest levels of government. The summit is aimed at setting the world up for success on multiple fronts as we work to address the climate crisis, including emissions reductions, finance, innovation and job creation, and resilience and adaptation. So again,
something that struck me real quick before I forget, there's an interesting correlation between COVID and the climate crisis, that they're both crises by the liberals are being presented as the greatest opportunity in mankind's history to quote unquote build back better and to create, you know, millions of supposedly good paying jobs and all of this stuff. It's just an interesting parallel between the two. These crises are being presented as, you know, we've got to seize this opportunity and seize the day.
Yes, for this great reset, this total change of everything you do. And again, ultimately, what do these people want to do? It is exactly what communism always does. Communism wants to eliminate the strata of classes, that there are like all different levels of people in society, economically, socially, and collapse it to two. The 99.9% of the world who are essentially slaves to the communist system, and the party leaders, the elite, who live in luxury. And again, that's what these environmentalists have always wanted. What do they want to do? This is the whole point of the Green New Deal. Basically make it so people can't travel, get rid of cars, get rid of everything, have limited electricity, so they can't do anything. Meanwhile, John Kerry and Al Gore and Thunberg and all these people fly around in private jets, burning up jet fuel, right? Emitting whatever into the environment. And that's what they eventually want to get to, a world where there's everybody who basically has everything taken away from them. Because of this crisis, you have to live with limited electricity, with inability to fly, but we, the top leaders, obviously we need to fly around in our private jets to these big climate summit meetings. It's exactly what they want to create. And that is what communism does everywhere, is bifurcate the world and into.
This is essentially what the New world order is, which, by the way, Mikhail Gorbachev was one of the first world leaders to use that phrase in his 1988 speech to the United Nations.
Yes, very, very true. So that's where they're headed. That's what this is Great Reset is about. And that's their other reason for population control. Why? Because they need a smaller population to control. It makes it easier to control the population, right? When the slave populations got too large in history, that's when there was a problem. And that's what happened in Egypt, for example. The slave population of the Israelites was getting too large, was getting out of control. And they said, we can't handle these anymore. So what did they do? They started demanding that all male children be killed. That's the story of Moses. You remember there was a decree that male children had to be killed. Why? It was population control. They said, oh, the slaves are getting too numerous. They could overrun us. And that's what this is really all about. This population control is to keep the slave population under control, because that's what they eventually want to establish, a slave population. The equality of communism is an equality of poverty for all and elitism for the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes.
So that's, as we said, Biden's introduction. They have a little video here. You can see their little symbol for their summit, introducing this leaders summit, what it was all about.
Our planet is changing. Since the late 19th century, the Earth has already warmed at least 1 degree Celsius. And we are seeing the devastating impacts. More severe weather, catastrophic events, and challenges to our lives and livelihoods. How much warmer our planet gets and how severe the impacts will be is up to us. The next decade is critical. We must change the course we're on in order to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we succeed, we will protect the most vulnerable, preserve ecosystems and wildlife, reduce our exposure to extreme heat and storms, create a healthier, more equitable world, and create new economic opportunities for all. The challenges are clear, but so are the solutions. The question is, how do we move fast enough to keep the world on track to limit the rise in global temperatures?
In my view, we've already waited too long to deal with this climate crisis. We can't wait any longer.
How do we make bigger, bolder changes than ever before?
Governments must deliver the transformational change our world needs and that people demand with much stronger ambition.
That gives you the flavor of it, right? 2 themes, right? Fear and all these images of, you know, these horrible things are going to happen, and transformational change. Everything's got to change. Everything has to be reset. And notice this video is exactly what I'm saying about the logical fallacy that true science would not accept, which is the old fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Because something happens after something else, it caused it, which is a logical fallacy. Just because things come in sequential order doesn't mean one is a cause of another. So this is what they say. The Earth's degrees, the temperature of the Earth has gone up 1 degree. Therefore, right, that is, and so let me back up. They first say, starting the 19th century, there is an increase in fossil fuel emissions. Notice that date, they pick end of the 19th century. Following that, the Earth's temperature goes up 1 degree. Therefore, it was the emissions that caused it. Well, you need proof to that. Right? You need proof. Secondly, the Earth's gone up 1 degree. Therefore, there are more storms and things. Where's the proof to show it? And again, they never want to look at history because history would disprove it. The Rise of the Roman Empire, there's a great book called The Fall of the Roman Empire by Kyle Harper, where he talks about what are some of the things that caused the Roman Empire to fall. One of the things he talks about is that what helped the Roman Empire grow was an increase in the temperature of the Earth as the Roman Empire was rising. And so what happened was what's now the northern part of Italy into southern Europe was much warmer. And he gives a lot of evidence of this, that there were vineyards that supported grape growth much further north into Europe. And again, a lot of climate historical data showing there was this optimal climate period that happened as the Roman Empire was rising, which caused more lands that could be farmed, which increased the economic power of the Roman Empire, which interestingly increased population, which is another driver of economic growth. When population rises, you see economic growth. So it was this period where the Earth's temperature was rising, and it helped the Roman Empire. And what he points out is by the time it fell, and there were other factors that were going on, but when the time it fell, the Earth's temperature began to cool and food supplies began to be damaged, harvests failed, there was famine because of this. And again, none of this was caused by greenhouse emissions, obviously, because it didn't exist then. But, and again, the point is just if people looked at history, you'd say, well, there's other things going on. That's not denying that the climate is changing or that, you know, the data is showing an increase. The question is, what's causing it and what effects is it really having? And you know, is there anything we can do about it? Right, they're the real questions. But instead of real scientists looking at it with a questioning, critical eye, it's just propaganda like that, scare people.
And also the assumption, which was present in the video clip, is that whether or not the Earth gets warmer is up to us.
Yes.
The implication being it's solely up to us. There are no other factors involved.
Yes. So among the 40 bigly, and again, you started to see, look at all the connections, all of them, the Davos reset crowd, including Biden.
And Bill Gates, by the way, is speaking today. Yeah.
Bill Gates. Pope Francis gave a message to the summit. So again, his goal seems to be to become the Pontifex Maximus of the New World Order Great Reset, right? So kind of the Catholic Church is sort of over and done with, and but I need a role. So my role will be to become the new great high priest of the environmentalist Great Reset New World Order movement, and I'll be their kind of, you know, resonant, you know, just like in the time of the Roman Empire, where the Pontifex Maximus was essentially under the control of the Roman Emperor. The Senate appointed him. It was a political figure who was used. That's sort of what he wants to become. Well, we then remind him what happened at the time of the emperors. Once they took over power, they subsumed that role into themselves. So the emperor became the Pontifex Maximus, right? That you had this sort of stealing of religious power to the secular state, which was only broken by the coming of Christianity, which separated those roles, distinguished those roles between the Pope and the Emperor. Yeah. But in any event, just read a little bit from Pope Francis's rousing message to the summit. Quote, "We know that we do not come out of a crisis in the same way. Either we come out better or worse. And our concern is to see that the environment is cleaner, healthier, and conserved, and to take care of nature so that it takes care of us." Now, again, notice here this Build Back Better motto of the Davos Great Reset. He's got, we want to come out of this better. Very ambiguous by what he means by the crisis. I think he's sort of blurring the COVID and the so-called environmental crisis. Why? Because he's already told us there's a connection between them, right? That Mother Nature is punishing us essentially for the climate crisis, which makes her be a rational being that can act with a will, which is impossible. And then also, again, notice this, it's this modernist trick, right? We want to see that the environment is cleaner, healthier. Well, of course, who would be opposed to that, right? Do you really say, I'm in favor of unhealthy water, I'm in favor of poison, right? But no, nobody's, nobody.
Communism always champions something legitimate in an illegitimate way.
Exactly, in an illegitimate way. Certainly, yes, we should have clean water, we should have clean air, because it's good for our health, right? Remember, the environment and nature is ordered towards man. That's what Genesis tells us, that the environment, the creation, all of the material creation is ordered towards its peak and height, which is man, who rules it, symbolized by Adam naming all of the creatures, right? So yes, we want a healthy environment because it is part of our material nature that's ordered to us. But then that sort of acceptable and laudable goal, is then now linked to this neo-paganism, right? We have to take care of nature, and this is always a threat of paganism. Remember, look at every pagan religion. We need to appease the sun god by offering live human sacrifice, or the sun will go away and punish us, but not take care of us, and our plants will die, right? Or we need to offer some sacrifice to the rain god, or we won't get rain. This is paganism. We need to take care of nature, so it takes care of us. This is the bargain idea that paganism had about sacrifice. So
there's no mention of God whatsoever in Pope Francis's brief remarks.
Right. And again, I didn't read them all. They're not much longer, but there is not a single bit of reference to our Lord Jesus Christ or God, because God has been conflated with nature in his role as the Pontific Maximus of this New World Order. Well, interestingly, and Matt alluded to this, Xi Jinping, the world leader of communism. He's the head of the Chinese Communist Party, but essentially the CCP is, what the Soviet Politburo used to be at the time of before Gorbachev, the kind of mastermind, because remember, communism is international, the world international movement. So he is really the head of this, as Archbishop Vigano has told us. The Pope answers to him, as Vigano has told us. Remember, he's told us the Vatican is the Vatican branch of this deep state controlled by the invisible enemy of communism. He's told us that Biden and Bergoglio are as beholden to the Chinese communists, each one of them is just as beholden. Right. And here's what he had to say, quote, "Mother Nature has nourished us, and we must treat Mother Nature as our root, respect it, protect it, and follow its laws. Failure to respect nature or follow its laws will only invite its revenge."
And the irony is that this is the man who violates the natural law on a daily basis.
Well, number one, yes, the natural law is not of nature. It is the law of God. Right. And not only does he violate the natural law, but he also is the head of a country that is the biggest polluter in the world. Right. And you remember the so-called Paris Climate Accords essentially says to the rest of the world, you've got to do all these dramatic reset things, but China, you don't have to do anything. You can just keep polluting. That China factually is the largest polluting nation in the world in terms of poisoning the environment with poisons and toxins. So, I mean, this is like, somebody who owns 1,000 slaves saying, oh, you guys shouldn't own slaves, right? I mean, it's just such hypocrisy. Well, and Biden is so concerned for the care of the environment and nature, but he's not actually concerned about human beings, because he just this week, when he was having this hootenanny about the environment, undid President Donald Trump's ban on using aborted fetal tissue for taxpayer-funded research. So Trump said, you cannot take cells from aborted children, victims of abortion, and use them for research. And if you do, you lose all your tax-funded payment. And all of a sudden, all the researchers didn't do it because they live off the government tax funding. Biden, nope, no, that's fine. You can just make use of the victims of the largest genocide in human history, and go ahead, no problem. So he really cares about, he and Francis Bergoglio care about the environment, but really show no concern for the hundreds of millions of children who do not see the light outside of their mother's womb and who do not come to the baptismal font because their life is ended before they are able to do that. So clearly this is, as Archbishop Vigano has told us over and over again, as he reiterates in his latest declaration about the Vatican Healthcare Conference, which you can see on our website, this is a global movement on multiple fronts to essentially establish paganism as the world religion of communism.
Yes. And speaking of paganism, one of the practices of paganism throughout history has been sexual immorality, sexual depravity. And that is really the theme of our next story, which we don't often cite the National Catholic Distorter. I mean reporter.
Yes.
But this is where the story comes from this week. It was tweeted out by Father James Martin, S.J., and it published on April 16th. So the headline says, Germany's top Catholic bishop sees change coming for blessing same-sex unions. And it's very interesting that he's saying this, because the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as we reported, about a month ago now, came out with a very clear no to the blessing of those unions. So I'm not sure why he thinks there's a change coming. But the bishop in question is Georg Botzing, who is the president of the German Bishops' Conference. And this article quotes him several different times. He says, excuse me, people in homosexual partnerships want the blessing of the church, one that is not concealed, told the German newspaper. They want the church to hold their life in such value that they are giving the blessing of God and not denied it. As if the church has the ability to bless sin, which thanks be to God, the CDF said no, the church cannot bless sin, which should be obvious to everyone. God cannot bless that which he calls an abomination in sacred scripture. So he goes on to say, I believe that we must evaluate homosexuality and life partnerships outside of marriage in a new way. We can no longer go on the assumption of natural law alone. Good grief.
Well, what about the divine law? I guess he's throwing that out too.
But he goes on, we must think much more strongly in such categories as caring and responsibility for one another. Well, it's not caring to live in a state of grave sin, and also in just on a natural level, a very unhealthy lifestyle. It's so it's just unbelievable that a successor of the apostles would say such things.
Well, and again, they always want to conflate things, right? So what they want blessed, again, is intrinsic sin, intrinsic evil, which both the natural and the divine law, right, throughout Scripture have condemned. But they want to mix this up with somehow that you're not accepting the person as a human being created in the image and likeness of God, which is not true. They conflate being and action, right?
Yes.
So what you are is a human being created in the image and likeness of God with an immortal soul. But what you do is different from what you are, right? Your actions are different from your being, and condemning your actions doesn't condemn your being, but they want to conflate that. Then they want to conflate, oh, well, there are people who are taking care of each other, caring for each other, and that needs to be blessed. They're not talking about, and maybe some people have this in their family, two maiden aunts who, never got married, or maybe something happened, and they, in their older years live together and care for each other, again, with no implication of any immoral behavior, but they're sort of not married, but they happen to be, to share, and one's caring for the other. But obviously the church would always say, oh, you're doing this good thing, you're caring for someone. But they want to say, kind of equate the sin that has nothing to do with caring for another human being as if they're kind of interconnected and need to be there. And that, again, is another deception they try to use to say essentially to God the sin of Lucifer, non serviam. So God says this is a sin, and they're saying, I will not serve. I want to reevaluate that, God. God, you got that wrong. And I'm going to reevaluate what's a sin and what's not. That is the knowledge of good and evil that is promised by the devil by rejecting obedience to God.
Yes. So ultimately, this article from the National Catholic Reporter ends with quoting him responding to the March 15th decree of the CDF, giving a no to the question about blessing same-sex unions. He says, but this, referring to the Vatican's no, does not help, because for a long time now, there has been a pastoral development which goes beyond it. Yeah, that's called dissension. It's called heresy. And he ultimately ends by saying, and this means a change is pending. So I don't know, there's no explanation as to why he thinks a change is pending. And obviously we know the Church of Christ, Holy Mother Church, can never approve this. But perhaps we will see a schism, of some dioceses in Germany, because if they continue to go down this path, that's what they're pursuing.
Well, and to be honest, we have a de facto schism already, right? It exists. The German church and these things and dioceses around the world. What we don't have is a pope who stands up and declares it de jure and just says, and who makes it official, this is a schism. But we clearly, with a bishop saying this, he is clearly in schism. He is not in communion with the Church of Christ to say such things. So, frankly, when people say we have a schism coming, we just have the official declaration of his existence.
Exactly.
Yes.
So one of the bishops another bishop who will no doubt be a part of the schismatic group once that becomes formal at some point, is a Bishop Robert McElroy, the bishop of the Diocese of San Diego. News came out this week. LifeSite News reported dissident San Diego bishop elevated to Vatican position. Pope Francis ally Robert McElroy, who dissents from church teaching on abortion and marriage, joins the dicastery for promoting integral human development in Rome, which is basically the Great Reset office of the Vatican.
Yes.
They're the ones who participate. Like Cardinal Peter Turkson is the prefect. He's spoken at these Davos meetings, at the World Economic Forum, et cetera, et cetera. So Bishop Robert McElroy is actually named by Archbishop Vigano in his original testimony. Vigano says, quote, "The appointment of McElroy in San Diego was also orchestrated from above." In his testimony, he talks about this homosexual current, or this network within the hierarchy, appointing their own, and he identifies Robert McElroy as one of the beneficiaries of that system. And so he says, orchestrated from above with an encrypted peremptory order to me as nuncio when he was serving here in the United States by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who told Archbishop Vigano, quote, "Reserve the see of San Diego for McElroy." And Vigano also says McElroy was also well aware of McCarrick's abuses, referring to Theodore McCarrick, as can be seen from a letter sent to him by Richard Sipe on July 28th, 2016.
And Richard Sipe is one of the main victims who came out and was reporting what was done.
Yes. So long story short, we just continue to see the curia being stacked with spiritual nephews of Uncle Ted McCarrick. You know, got Blaise Supich on the Congregation for Bishops. Now, more recently, we reported about Joseph Tobin, Cardinal Joseph Tobin, being appointed to that same Vatican congregation, and now we hear about McElroy being appointed to the Dicastery for Human Development. So just unbelievable developments.
Yes, yes, and again, this mafia, as Archbishop Vigano has referred to it, has been, promoting and moving into key positions, and this superimposition or this eclipse of the true church by these outside enemies who have infiltrated the church, and we just see they're full steam ahead with the announcement of this appointment.
Yes. Yes.
So for our final story, we want to direct you to the latest installment in a debate that has been going on really online for a while. Professor Roberto de Mattei published a little pamphlet essentially defending or arguing in favor of the Francis-Vatican position on the moral licity of the COVID-19 vaccines, all of which today have been derived from children's cells who were murdered in abortion, either in the development or the testing of those vaccines. And Mattei has been kind of a platform for this debate, because they've published Robert de Mattei's arguments, and then they've had some various responses. Well, Christopher Ferrara, our longtime contributor to CFN, has entered this debate in part one. Again, this is only the first half. The second half will be coming out shortly in a response to Professor de Mattei. And this first part is really dedicated to, as I think Matt indicated, getting a lot of the facts on the table. And he mentioned you see a lot of those links and footnotes all throughout here. And what we're dealing with is the application of a moral principle. So within this debate, de Mattei, Ferrara, all of them don't dispute at the level of principle that there are concepts that we've talked about before in terms of double effect and moral cooperation, or material and formal cooperation with evil, sort of tainted goods, the use of tainted goods, the products of sin. Everybody agrees on the principles, but it's how do you apply them to the current facts And that is where there is the level of disagreement. And again, principles are absolute. If you say, I reject, clear moral principles that are part of the doctrine of the church, you're either in the church or out. How they get applied is a different intellectual exercise. It is going from the speculative intellect, like how do I know what is true, to the practical intellect. How do I apply what I know is true to the contingent matter, as the term St. Thomas Aquinas uses, the sort of various facts. And that's really where Chris starts his article. And you'll see how he develops into the second part. But to go through, okay, what are all the facts? And if the argument of the CDF or Professor de Mattei is there's this sort of grave existential threat to humanity, there is a morally questionable or a solution that has moral difficulties with it. It's morally questionable on how it arose. How do we sort of balance these competing interests to decide what is permissible, what we can do, and on the other side, what we must do? Because as he points out, there's an element of de Mattei's argument that it is not just permissible to make use of these means, but it is obligatory, or at least morally obligatory. So in this first one, Chris sort of takes on sort of the larger picture. So if you're interested in some of these larger debates about COVID-19 lockdowns and things, he sort of addresses that is this really a circumstance that warrants for putting the vaccines aside? Again, that's a later issue.
Is it really, in other words, is it really a plague that bodies are piling up by the millions? And it's,
yes.
Is there proportionality between the actual situation and the proposed remedy, namely these vaccines?
Yes. Well, and again, he doesn't get to the vaccines yet. He says these other remedies, like shutting down entire countries, destroying the economy, locking people in their homes, is there, and again, that's a prudential political judgment, which can be just or unjust. It's unjust if it's so radically disproportionate to the good being sought, right? A sort of simple, folksy way to say it is like, is the medicine worse than the cure, right? And he goes through an example that's used by many. It's used by de Mattei in his pamphlet, and it goes back to a cholera epidemic that occurred in the reign of Pope Gregory the 16th in Italy in 1837. And they sort of say, he, in order to sort of deal with this cholera epidemic, he decreed in the Papal States that he is the temporal leader of at the time, measures to sort of prevent the spread of cholera. So a 14-day quarantine, for example, to kind of get things under control. A suspension not of all religious service, but of large religious festivals. That's kind of an important distinction, and other large gatherings. But it is very clear he did not suspend mass attendance or regular masses throughout this couple of weeks and couple of months period. And what Chris points out is, this is just a false historical example, because he again runs through the various.
If I could just read a quick quote to give people an idea. He says that in the 19th century, cholera was an untreatable disease with infection and case fatality rates that dwarf those of COVID-19. In the city of Forio, for example, in Italy, 316 people out of 5,500, nearly 6% of the total population, died during the 1837 outbreak. By comparison, COVID-19 has proven fatal to 0.2%, so 0.2% of Italy's population. And he gives the numbers: 115,000 deaths compared to a total population of roughly 60 million, and less than 0.2% of the US population, with 1/3 or more of total deaths occurring in nursing homes in which the victims were imprisoned under government policies, allowing the virus to spread like wildfire among very elderly, already ailing residents nearing the end of their lifespans. These death tolls are a fraction of those from cancer or heart disease, from which many of the COVID patients who died were already suffering. So he goes on, ultimately he ends that section of his article saying, to recognize these facts, namely the difference between what happened in 1837 and what's happening today, is not to, quote, deny the existence of the pandemic, as Professor de Mattei mentions in his booklet, but rather, as Chris says, is to recognize its true scope and what that should mean for a sane public policy, which certainly does not require vaccination of the entire Western world. And then he gets into the statistical dishonesty that's been a real epidemic throughout all of this COVID-19 situation.
Yes, and again, this is laying the foundation for the moral analysis, which has to rest on a proper understanding of the facts. Again, when there's ever a sort of balancing in moral principles in terms of effects, you had to find a proportion. You have to understand the negative, the evil effects, right? People getting sick and dying, versus what the evils connected with what you're doing. And again, the second part, which will continue the analysis, will be posted soon and be printed in the paper. Part one is already in the paper. So again, there's extensive hyperlinks in addition to 3 dozen or so, or more than 3 dozen footnotes. So as with Chris, who has a litigating attorney's a tendency to pile on the evidence, right? Prove the point 20 times over. You will see that in terms of lots of evidence in entering this debate. So I think this will be an important contribution to this debate that has been ongoing for a couple of weeks now.
And before we wrap up, I just wanted to also mention, Chris does begin this part one by saying, I have great admiration for Professor Roberto de Mattei. So we don't want people to get the impression that because we're publishing this, we, are now the enemy of Professor de Mattei. This is a respectful, scholarly debate among brothers in the church. And that's how we want to make sure that people understand, people can have disagreements regarding the practical intellect, as Brian described. And we just earlier this year, we published some of Professor de Mattei's analysis and his reflections on the COVID pandemic and such in light of the message of Fatima. So long story short, we want people to understand we still respect and esteem him, and we're not trying to antagonize him, but we do feel like this important subject needs to be addressed, and some of his arguments do warrant a response. So
yes. Well, that wraps up our stories. Again, please see our website for Chris's article. We have much more detail. But that brings us to the end of our roundup for the week ending April 23rd. And if you've enjoyed this content, please share it. Please, I ask you to subscribe to our Rumble channel. Again, particularly given the last story, our YouTube channel may be censored completely at some point. Some of our videos have already been taken down. So if you don't want to miss a week, if it goes down, there's no way for us to post a video to tell you it's gone, because it'll just be gone, as happened to LifeSite News. But if you subscribe to our Rumble channel, that will be there, and you'll be able to see videos as they come. So again, most of our viewers still are on YouTube. If you could begin migrating, it may be prudent at this point. We certainly will put announcements out on other platforms that we can, and on our website ultimately, which is not controlled by the big tech censors. So please do begin considering subscribing to our Rumble channel as a precaution. Do check our website regularly for updates. And with all of that, please share all this free content with everyone you can, and hopefully help us in our mission to get the truth and information on the church and the world of our day out there. And if you enjoy, again, this free content that's available on the website and here, please consider subscribing to the monthly periodical. The May issue is the process of being printed, will be out next week, and has a great lineup of in-depth stories, both those that expose the crisis in the church and world, but also very efficacious stories. In the interview I released last night, I mentioned there's a beautiful article by Father Couture on the Shroud of Turin, which is this time of the resurrection that we're celebrating, is very wonderful to help with your meditation. There's a series on the 10 Commandments on the Roman Catechism right now on the 10 Commandments that is, again, helpful.
Specifically the 6th commandment, which is very relevant to some of what we discussed today. Yes.
Yes. So a wealth of content that you won't see for free on our website. So we'll end as we traditionally do with Matt leading us with the Hail Mary, the angelic salutation, and then we'll pray the prayer that was revealed by our Lord to be a great prayer against Marxists and communists.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Eternal Father, I offer thee the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ and all the instruments of his holy passion, that thou mayest put division in the camp of thy enemies. For as thy beloved Son hath said, a kingdom divided against itself shall fall. Our Lady of Fatima,
Pray for us.
Our Lady of Good Success,
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Amen.
Wish you a wonderful weekend, third Sunday after Easter, and we will see you, God willing, week from today, and may God bless you.
God bless.